Look around you for a second. Bridges, cars, a garden shovel left out after the rain. We live in the age of steel, strong, uniform, everywhere, and yet it has a fatal flaw. The moment steel is born, it starts dying. It rusts, it corrodes, it returns to the earth. We spend billions every year painting it, coating it, replacing it, fighting a slow-motion collapse that never stops. But here's the question that should bother you. What if, more than 1,000 years ago, people with dirty hands and simple clay furnaces solved a problem that modern industry still can't fully escape? Picture a Viking ship forcing its way across the freezing Atlantic, stitched together not by advanced alloys, but by iron pulled from swamp mud. Then picture a pillar in India standing in open wind and rain for 16 centuries and refusing to rust away. That isn't magic. It's a lost technology. It's the story of bog iron. Welcome to Historia Prime. Today we're getting our boots muddy. We're going back to a time when iron wasn't dug from deep mines, it grew like a crop in wetlands. A time when blacksmiths worked with living metal, and the impurities we throw away today were the very thing that made iron endure. We're going to uncover the science, the sweat, and the survival logic behind the medieval blacksmith's rust-proof metal. And by the end of this journey, you might look at that rusty tool in your shed and ask a dangerous question. Did we actually move backward? Section 1. The living ore, when metal grows. To understand bog iron, you don't go down a mine shaft, you go to a swamp. Most people think iron is dead, ancient rock locked deep underground, blasted loose and hauled to the surface. Bog iron breaks that idea. It's one of the only metal ores humans ever treated like a renewable crop. It doesn't hide in mountains, it forms right beneath your boots. Here's how living ore happens. Deep underground, where oxygen is scarce, iron dissolves into groundwater, silent, invisible, like salt in the sea. But when that water rises into a peat bog or marsh, it meets two things it can't avoid: oxygen and life. The moment the iron-rich water hits air, the iron oxidizes. The ghost becomes solid, dropping out as tiny grains of iron compounds. Chemistry can do this alone, but slowly. Nature speeds it up with a workforce you never see. Iron-oxidizing bacteria, names like Gallionella and Leptothrix. They thrive in the thin boundary between deep, oxygen-starved mud and the breathable surface. They eat iron as part of their survival, and in the process they concentrate it, grain by grain, around plant roots and through peat layers, until the bog begins to seed itself with ore. And here's the part that matters for a medieval world, and for a modern one. Finding this treasure didn't require maps or miners. It required attention. Read the land. Look for stressed, withered grass. Look for reddish-brown mud. But the clearest signature, the one you can still find today, is that strange, oily rainbow film on still water. Most people see it and think pollution, gasoline, something modern and toxic. But touch it, and it tells you the truth. Oil swirls. This film cracks. It shatters like thin glass. That brittle sheen is the fingerprint of iron bacteria, nature's quiet arrow pointing downward, saying, "Dig here." And the real secret is what happens after you harvest. If you peel back the peat, take the iron nodules, then lay the bog back down, the system keeps working. Given time, 20 to 30 years, roughly one human generation, the groundwater and bacteria will rebuild the deposit. In other words, the swamp doesn't just contain iron, it grows it. And that changes everything, because it means medieval people weren't just extracting metal. They were partnering with an ecosystem and turning mud into permanence. Section 2. The harvest and the roast, turning mud into fuel for fire. So imagine you're a Viking Age settler. You've spotted that strange rainbow slick on still water, and you've pushed a wooden probe into the ground until you felt it. That gritty crunch of ore hiding under the peat. Now the real work begins. You dig, and what comes up doesn't look like treasure. It's sodden, black-brown chunks of peat, foul-smelling, heavy as sin with water, packed with little pea-sized nodules of iron. To an untrained eye, it's just swamp mud that rots in your hands. And that's the first lesson. The best materials often arrive disguised as garbage. Because you can't feed this straight into a furnace. Wet ore doesn't smelt. It hisses, it steams, it kills your heat. In the worst case, trapped moisture can make it spit and crack and ruin everything you built. So before you make metal, you do something that looks almost too simple to matter. You purify it with fire. This is roasting, not smelting, preparation. You build a great pyre of wood, spread the ore across the top, and let it bake hard in open flame, pushing into that brutal range, 600 to 800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to change the ore without melting it. And you're doing three things at once. First, you drive off water, because a furnace can't fight steam and win. Second, you burn away the organic peat clinging to the nodules, stripping the swamp out of the stone. But most importantly, you're hunting a hidden enemy, sulfur. Sulfur is the blacksmith's nightmare. Too much of it turns iron hot short, which means when you finally pull the bloom and try to hammer it while it's glowing, it crumbles instead, like dry cheese breaking under a blade. Roasting is how you prevent that betrayal. By the end, the ore changes. The fire cracks it and opens it up, making it porous, lighter, almost like rust-colored popcorn, ready to accept the furnace gases that will do the real alchemy. Earth becomes potential. And that's the second lesson. Survival isn't just about heat and strength. It's about preparation, removing what weakens you before the moment that matters. Section 3. The Bloomery. Birth without melting. Now comes the moment of creation, the Bloomery furnace. Forget modern blast furnaces and rivers of liquid metal. The medieval smith couldn't truly melt iron. Pure iron needs about 1,538 degrees Celsius, and a clay chimney powered by charcoal and human muscle rarely climbed past roughly 1,300 degrees Celsius. So the question is simple and almost unsettling. How do you make metal if you can't melt it? You don't melt it, you change it. A bloomery is brutally simple. A clay and sand stack, sometimes stiffened with fibers or dung for insulation. You pack it with charcoal, light it, and once it's roaring, you begin the rhythm. Charcoal, roasted ore, charcoal, ore, layer by layer for hours. Then the invisible part begins. Inside that heat, charcoal doesn't just burn. It creates carbon monoxide, and carbon monoxide is hungry for oxygen. As the gas rises through the furnace, it steals oxygen atoms from the iron ore. What's left behind is metallic iron, born not by melting, but by reduction. Here's the catch. The iron stays solid. It forms tiny sticky grains that sink and cling, welding themselves together into a spongy, glowing mass at the bottom. Meanwhile, the dirt, sand, rock, silica, does melt. It becomes slag, a liquid glass that drips down and pools beneath the iron, like a hot shield separating metal from ash. This is where the process turns into a test of endurance. For 8 to 10 hours, you work the bellows, listen to the fire's breathing, watch the flames' color and behavior, and pray you've read it right. Because if you're wrong, you don't get a second chance. You get a lump of dead stone. But if you're right, you break open the furnace wall, and you meet it. The bloom. A jagged, heavy, glowing sponge of iron, dripping with glassy slag, like a meteor pulled from the earth's throat. And you don't have time to admire it. You have seconds. You drag that mass to a stump and hammer while it's still screaming hot, consolidating it, driving out air pockets, welding the grains tighter, squeezing liquid slag out like water from a sponge. This is the birth of wrought iron. And unlike modern steel, clean, uniform, predictable, this iron is dirty. It carries microscopic threads of slag stretched through the metal. It has a personality. And the unsettling twist is this: those imperfections, the ones modern industry spends billions removing, are exactly what will help make bog iron legendary. Section 4. The Rustproof Secret: the impurities that made iron immortal. We've made iron, but here's the problem that should make you pause. Why does a monument like the Iron Pillar of Delhi stand for about 16 centuries without rotting away, while a modern car fender can dissolve in a decade? Why does the swamp metal sometimes outlive the factory metal? The answer isn't a miracle. It's two mistakes that modern industry is trained to eliminate: slag and phosphorus. In modern steelmaking, we scrub metal clean. We chase uniformity. We want iron and carbon, nothing else. Phosphorus is treated like a contaminant because it can make steel brittle, especially in cold conditions. But bog iron doesn't care what we prefer. It can be naturally rich in phosphorus, sometimes up to a few percent, and for the medieval smith, that was a double-edged sword. It could be stubborn to work, yes, but it came with something modern steel often lacks: a built-in shield. Here's what happens with ordinary steel. When it rusts, the rust layer is porous and weak. It flakes off, exposes fresh metal, and the cycle repeats: rust, flake, until the damage bites deeper and deeper. That's why corrosion feels like a slow hunger. High phosphorus bog iron behaves differently. When weather reaches the surface, phosphorus helps form a thin, protective film, an iron phosphate patina that clings instead of crumbling. It's not that bright, destructive red rust. It's a darker, stable skin that seals the surface and slows oxygen's path inward. Instead of endlessly shedding layers and bleeding metal, the iron learns how to scar and survive. And then there's slag. Remember that liquid glass inside the bloom, the stuff modern metallurgy tries to remove? The Vikings didn't remove it, they forged with it. As the iron was hammered into bars, those tiny glass pockets stretched into microscopic threads running through the metal, like hidden reinforcements. Think of it like a primitive composite, almost the logic of fiberglass or carbon fiber, centuries before the words existed. Those slag stringers act like walls. If corrosion tries to move inward, it hits glass and stalls. The rust is forced to spread sideways along the surface instead of tunneling deep into the core. The iron doesn't just resist decay chemically, it resists it physically too. And that's the unsettling twist. What we call impurities were, in this case, the immune system. By lacking the technology to purify iron into something perfectly predictable, medieval smiths accidentally created something engineered for longevity. Metal that didn't just exist in nature, but negotiated with it. Which leaves us with a lesson you can still apply today. Sometimes the pursuit of perfect cleanliness doesn't make a system stronger. Sometimes it strips away the very complexity that kept it alive. Section 5. Viking Proof: when mud held an empire together. The Vikings didn't know the chemistry. They had no words for iron phosphate films and no microscopes to see glassy slag threads locked inside the metal. But they didn't need any of that because they had something modern people forget to trust. They watched how materials behave. They learned that bog iron was stubborn, hard, and strangely durable, and then they built their world on it. There's a moment in Viking history that feels almost too revealing. At Lance aux Meadows, the only confirmed Viking site in North America, Norse explorers landed in Newfoundland about 1,000 years ago. And what did they do first? They didn't just throw up walls and call it a settlement. They went looking for a peat bog. They harvested ore. They smelted iron. They produced only a few kilograms, around 3, mostly for rivets to repair ships. And that number matters because it tells you what their real lifeline was. They crossed an ocean, and the survival of the return journey depended on swamp mud in a foreign land. Not trade, not luck, not a supply chain. Local resources turned into metal under pressure. But bog iron had a cost. Its phosphorus-rich toughness came with a dangerous edge: brittleness. A sword made entirely from high phosphorus bog iron could snap when it struck a shield in deep winter cold. So Viking master smith did what great engineers always do. They didn't demand one perfect material. They built a system. They developed composite construction, using softer, tougher, low-phosphorus iron for the core of a blade so it could flex, and welding harder, phosphorus-rich bog iron along the edges to keep it biting sharp. Strength where you need it, resilience where you can't afford to fail. That logic lives inside their most famous weapons, the pattern-welded swords. They took bright, phosphorus-rich iron that gleamed silver when polished and paired it with darker iron, then twisted the rods together like rope and forged them into one living blade. Later, when the finished sword was etched, the phosphorus-rich sections resisted and stayed light, while the other metal darkened, and suddenly the surface looked alive, like serpents or dragons running down the steel. It wasn't just decoration, it was proof. Proof that the blade was engineered, not merely forged. Proof of a deliberate marriage between materials made visible to the eye. High technology, not with laboratories and patents, but with a hammer, a fire, and an understanding that different problems require different kinds of strength. And that's a lesson you can still use today. Don't bet everything on one perfect solution. Build with layers. Combine what lasts with what flexes. Use the hard edge where it matters and keep a tough core underneath. Because in the Viking world, and in ours, the things that break first are rarely the things that look impressive. They're the things that were asked to do one job they were never built to do. Section 6. The economics of permanence, when we chose disposable metal. So if bog iron was that good, if it resisted rust, if it could be harvested from wetlands without digging deep mines, then why did the world abandon it? The answer is simple, and it's a little depressing. We traded quality for quantity. Bog iron is slow. A bloomery gives you a small return, maybe a fifth of the iron locked inside the ore, and even that doesn't arrive as convenient bars. It arrives as a rough bloom that has to be hammered by hand, worked and reworked, turned into usable metal through sweat and time. It's craft, it's labor, it's a whole day of fire to earn a few kilograms of permanence. Then, in the 18th and 19th centuries, everything changed. We built blast furnaces. We stopped relying on charcoal and moved to coke. We finally got hot enough to melt iron into a liquid and pour it like water into molds. Suddenly, we weren't making kilograms a day. We were making tons. Railways, skyscrapers, bridges, an entire industrial world rose on that flood of metal. But the chemistry of mass production comes with a hidden cost. To make steel consistent and cheap, we had to strip it down. We removed the phosphorus. We removed the slag. We purified the metal until it became predictable, strong in a controlled way, easy to standardize, perfect for an industrial economy. And in doing that, we didn't just clean it, we disarmed it. We stripped away the very immune system that helped older iron survive weather and time. We created metal that was powerful but defenseless against nature's slow attack. That's when we entered a new era, not the age of steel, but the age of replacement, the era of the disposable. Today we manufacture steel, expecting it to fail. We build tools that live a few years, then die. We design infrastructure that survives only because we spend fortunes coating it, repainting it, constantly fighting corrosion like a war we've agreed to fund forever. Contrast that with the Viking Age. An axe wasn't a casual purchase. It was a generational object. Expensive, yes, but maintained, oiled, respected. The tool was meant to outlive you, and the metal itself fought to stay alive. Now we do the opposite. We buy cheap, leave it in the rain, watch it rot, and replace it again and again, mistaking convenience for progress. We solved the problem of production, and in return, we inherited the problem of waste. Section 7. Survival Lessons for the Modern World. The skill we forgot we needed. So what do we do with this story, sitting here in the 21st century, with smartphones in our pockets and stainless steel in our kitchens? Why should bog iron matter to you at all? Because it's not just metallurgy, it's a blueprint for resilience. The first lesson is this: the ancient smiths didn't fight nature, they recruited it. They didn't curse the swamp for being messy. They understood that the bacteria, the peat, and the strange chemistry of wetlands could do something mines couldn't: regenerate. They didn't demand purity, they embraced complexity, and that complexity gave their iron an edge we still envy today. If you want a tool, a home, or even a life that lasts, you don't always win by stripping everything down to the simplest, cleanest version. Sometimes you win by building systems that can heal, adapt, and protect themselves. And then comes the second lesson, and it's the uncomfortable one: capability. If the grid goes down and supply chains snap, mines don't just slow, they stop. You can't run a modern blast furnace with a couple friends and a good attitude. You can't order replacement parts from a factory that no longer ships. Our entire metal world depends on a thin, invisible network of electricity, logistics, and industrial scale. But bog iron doesn't depend on any of that. It's still out there, in Scandinavian wetlands, in the swamps of New Jersey, in the bogs of Canada, quietly rebuilding itself right now, grain by grain, year after year, whether we remember it or not. And that means the knowledge of how to smelt it, how to make charcoal, how to build a simple clay stack, how to coax metal out of mud, isn't just historical trivia. It's one of the deepest survival skills a human being can carry. It's the bridge between the Stone Age and the Space Age, because it proves something we've forgotten in our obsession with electronics. High technology doesn't always mean microchips. Sometimes high technology is knowing what matters inside the material. Sometimes it's understanding that a tiny glassy thread inside iron can decide whether a nail lasts 10 years or 1,000. And maybe that's the real warning buried in this swamp story. Progress isn't only what we invent, it's what we're still capable of making when everything else disappears. Conclusion: the wisdom of the bog. The next time you walk past a marsh and catch that sour, rotten smell of wet vegetation, or you notice an oily shimmer on a stagnant pool, don't just see mud. Slow down, look closer, because what you're really looking at is the blood of the earth, iron in its most patient form. The same kind of material that helped Vikings cross oceans, that held ships together with rivets born from swamp water, that armed kings and built a world meant to endure. It's a reminder that nature doesn't only destroy metal, sometimes it grows it, and that's the uncomfortable takeaway. Sometimes the old ways weren't just harder, they were better. In our obsession with perfection and purity, we stripped away the rugged durability that once made tools feel almost immortal. We learned to produce more, faster, and quietly accepted a world where metal fails on schedule, where replacement is normal, and where progress often means dependency. So maybe bog iron isn't just a medieval curiosity. Maybe it's a message, a warning, and, if you're paying attention, an invitation. An invitation to relearn what lasts, to respect materials, to build with patience, to remember that the dirt we remove might be the very thing that keeps a system alive. This is Historia Prime. If you enjoyed digging into the mud with us, strike that like button like a blacksmith hammering a bloom, and subscribe for more lost history and forgotten science. Until next time, keep the fires burning.